What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Story 1. Not declassified but leaked. Operation Yellowhammer. The government tried to say it was old, but it had an August date on it. It's the UK government's plan for the eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. Basically, life in the UK would be turned upside down for a few months. Food and medical shortages are expected. The royal family might be evacuated to a safe place. The police will have too much on their hands to investigate crimes, etc. Story 2. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, and set up the country for the show that is Guatemala today, just like Nicaragua. Guatemala is a beautiful country and the people are also beautiful, but as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the US has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people come to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. There's also funding the death squads in Nicaragua and funding and training mass murderers in El Salvador, while artificially extending their civil war. This stuff is why I hate when shoulds say, they should stay in their country and fix their problems, when a good chunk of the problems in Central and South America were directly caused by the US. There's also this. Most of the torture programs got their start with the CIA. Story 3. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the Low, or Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on the 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid, watching the hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually, people sued, and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, the seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. Story 4. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband dealt with having their home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Story 5. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and was given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. It is terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Story 6. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. Decades later, it was revealed that some, if not all, of the astronauts survived the initial explosion as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to prevent breaching. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying deaths would have crippled the space program even more than it already did. In flight school, we looked at this, and there's evidence to support the claim that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious that things had gone wrong. They didn't die accepting their fate. They died as astronauts. That's something to be admired, in my opinion. Story 7. As part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs, but they only managed to get 10. And of those, only a few were implanted. The implanted dogs would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant that when the controllers weren't present, the dogs that had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. Story 8. MKUltra was a partially illegal, forced mind control experiment utilizing psychoactive drugs conducted by the CIA in the 1950s and 1960s. Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, participated in these tests in the 1960s, although his participation was voluntary. His experiences with government LSD experiments led him to become an advocate for psychedelics. His friends formed the Merry Pranksters, who were a precursor to the hippie counterculture in the 1960s. This upended a lot of social norms to the point where the establishment began to freak out, labeling the hippies as pro-Soviet and enacting the war on drugs to more effectively suppress the counterculture, along with other groups deemed undesirable. There was some serious racism going on too. The US pushed heavily for prohibition at the UN, so most countries in the world started suppressing drugs and the countercultures that used them. This horrible puritanism still affects drug policy to this day, even for things as benign as CBD. In the UK, for example, the Home Office mandates that all hemp sold must contain 0% THC and bans home growing. You need a license, which costs around £5,000, including a non-refundable application. Occasionally raiding hemp farmers and small CBD specialists, while large chains can sell full-spectrum extract that probably contains THC traces. If you're the CEO of British Sugar and you're married to the minister responsible for drug policy, though, you can grow THC-rich medical cannabis for export and make a fortune. None for British citizens, though. They can have their seizures and like them, unless they're making enough bad PR for the Home Office to make a rare exception. We also used to have an addiction treatment scheme so successful it was called the British system abroad, but it was wound up to appease the US's puritanical desire to crush the counterculture. Trillions in cash were wasted, millions of lives were ruined for nonviolent drug offenses, and thousands of morally repugnant gangs existed because of prohibition, all because shady military experiments let the cat out of the bag and released something they couldn't control. Story 9. I don't think it's classified, but there was a project called Thor, which aimed to use a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city's destroyed by a falling missile or bomb. It was called Rods from God, and it would have used kinetic energy without explosives. It would have used a series of 20,000-pound tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without the radiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space. Story 10. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point, the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. It showed how to dig an 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there was a nuclear threat, to get your family to go in there and cover it with a door. Obviously, that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later, it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so that if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own graves. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing lines as the US government did. Story 11. Not really terrifying, but messed up. After World War II, the US government took scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy is Werner von Braun, who built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day, they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentivize them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. Story 12. When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy due to her intellectual disability, her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy for her at the age of 23. At the time, the procedure had only been done about 100 times in the US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation, and they say that the neurosurgeons asked the patient to count from 10 to know where they should stop cutting. I've heard that they stopped when her speech became incoherent. The saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years, all because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. Story 13. This is a rabbit hole of a case, only partially classified by the CIA until information was released 3 years after his initial capture. Robert Levinson, a former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen on March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the US government was adamant that he was not acting with a government party, only private PI work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as a part of the CIA on an authorized mission to gather data on the Iranian regime. He had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson had 7 kids, one of whom traveled with his mom to Iran to find their dad and husband, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest-held American captive at 12 years. Story 14. Operation Unthinkable was a hypothetical UK war plan that would have started World War II before it was even over. It called for Allied troops to attack the Soviet Red Army at Berlin and push them out of Europe entirely. Not having the manpower to fight them alone, the plan not only relied heavily on American forces, but also called for the rearmament of German soldiers, who would then fight alongside the Allies. The plan didn't get much traction because public support by that point would have been close to zero, and the Americans weren't interested since they still had Japan to deal with. A war against the Soviets would likely lead to a Soviet-Japanese alliance. Among other obvious issues with the plan, it's not really terrifying, I suppose, but it would have fundamentally reshaped the world we live in today if it had gone ahead. Story 15. The CIA's heart attack gun. The KGB had a similar device, which prompted the CIA to invent one as well. In 1975, the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, also known as the Church Committee, looked into activities by the CIA, NSA, and FBI. In 1975, there were also White House and House of Representatives committees to look into those agencies. The heart attack gun was revealed at committee hearings. The first big issue for the committee was that those agencies had free rein to do what they wanted. The Church Committee's investigations led to the Senate Intelligence Committee overseeing the CIA, which until then had not had any congressional oversight. The very existence of the National Security Agency wasn't revealed to the public until the Church Committee. Other revelations include NSA spying on the American public without warrants, Project Minaret and Project Shamrock. Even committee chairman Frank Church had been spied on. The CIA illegally acquired information on Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. The CIA plotted the assassination of at least 5 foreign leaders. The CIA tried to work with American mobsters to have Fidel Castro Operation Mongoose. The CIA drugged unknowing individuals with LSD as part of mind control experiments, Project MKUltra, and destroyed documents related to the project. In the 1990s, the CIA provided flawed nuclear weapon plans to the Iranian government. Operation Merlin. The Iranians discovered and corrected the flaws, so their nuclear program was actually accelerated by the CIA. In 2014, there was a Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture. The CIA routinely used brutal torture methods against suspected terrorists and lied to other parts of the US government about them. Significant numbers of people held by the CIA were totally innocent. The committee found no instance where torture led to actionable intelligence. Torturers and those who authorized torture were not held accountable. The CIA spied on Senate committee members investigating them. The full report itself was classified and accidentally destroyed by the CIA. In 2005, the CIA destroyed video evidence of torture against detainees. No one was punished for destroying the evidence. Story 16. The documents from United States versus Reynolds. The short version is that a B-29 crashed and there was an official report about the cause. Families of people who died in the crash wanted the report, which may have included evidence of negligence that led to their deaths. Because the report was embarrassing, the US government refused to hand it over and claimed, falsely, that it contained sensitive information about military secrets. They asserted what is now known as the state secrets privilege, to keep facts from the affected families and from the public at large. Courts, up to the Supreme Court, accepted this argument and established the principle by precedent. Decades later, the report was declassified and there were no secrets in it. The entire thing was just a lie all along, and the courts went along with it. The practical result is that the government can just lie at any time about national security whenever they want to cover up evil or idiotic actions by government officials. They always get away with it. That's why, for example, people tortured by the CIA can't sue, because our torture program is a state secret. Story 17. The Diet Law of Pass Incident. This is one of the most eerie events in history. Essentially, a group of college students embarked on a hiking trip in Siberia. They never returned, and a rescue team was sent out to find them. The search party discovered their bodies scattered around, each with various injuries. One of the students was found without eyes or a tongue. None of them were clothed, just in their underwear, and temperatures so cold that any skin exposure could lead to instant frostbite. Their clothes were neatly packed up at the campsite, alongside their stove and the rest of their supplies. Radiation was also detected in the clothes. The tents appeared to have been sliced open from the inside. When it came time for their funerals, the USSR attempted to conceal their deaths, even removing leaflets regarding the funeral from the college campus where they were living before their deaths. This is truly bizarre. Story 18. The U.S.'s motivation to enter the Vietnam War was built on a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, also known as the USS Maddox incident, was an international confrontation that led to the United States engaging more directly in the Vietnam War. It involved one real and one falsely claimed confrontation between ships of North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American reports blamed North Vietnam for both incidents, but the Pentagon Papers, the memoirs of Robert McNamara, and NSA publications from 2005 proved material misinterpretation by the US government to justify a war against Vietnam. The outcome of these two incidents was the passage by Congress of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted US President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by communist aggression. The resolution served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying US conventional forces and the commencement of open warfare against North Vietnam. The same goes for the Gulf War. The Norea Testimony was a false testimony given before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus on October 10, 1990, by a 15-year-old girl who provided only her first name, Norea. The testimony was widely publicized and was cited numerous times by United States senators and President George H.W. Bush in their rationale for backing Kuwait in the Gulf War. In 1992, it was revealed that Norea's last name was Al-Aba, and that she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was run by the American public relations firm Hill & Knowlton for the Kuwaiti government. Following this, al-Sabah's testimony has come to be regarded as a classic example of modern atrocity propaganda. The same goes for the Iraq War. The uranium forgeries were forged documents initially released in 2001 by SISMI, Italian military intelligence, which seemed to depict an attempt made by Saddam Hussein in Iraq to purchase yellowcake uranium powder from Niger during the Iraq disarmament crisis. Based on these documents and other indicators, the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom asserted that Iraq violated United Nations sanctions against Iraq by attempting to procure nuclear material for the purpose of creating weapons of mass destruction. And wait, it gets better. Operation Northwood was a proposed false flag operation against the Cuban government that originated within the U.S. Department of Defense, or DoD, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or JCS, of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, or other U.S. government operatives to commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets, blaming them on the Cuban government and using them to justify a war against Cuba. The possibilities detailed in the document included the possible assassination of Cuban emigres, sinking boats of Cuban refugees in the high seas, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating violent terrorism in the U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by John F. Kennedy. The plan was drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, and sent to the Secretary of Defense. Although part of the U.S. government's anti-communist Cuban project, Operation Northwood was never officially accepted. It was authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but then rejected by President John F. Kennedy. According to currently released documentation, none of the operations became active under the auspices of the Operation Northwood proposals. The fact that the highest levels of Department of Defense and JCS thought that committing terrorist acts against U.S. citizens was an acceptable idea, and that none of these people were jailed for treason, really blows my mind. It makes me wonder what on earth is going through the heads of top brass today. Story 19. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through 1970s. It is sobering to know that tax dollars were used to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 during this time. Black and poor women were also affected. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 1960s, going to the doctor for an appendectomy and being sterilized without being informed. Many women did not find out for years, until they realized they should have gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. Story 20. To the best of my knowledge, there is a book called The Adam and Eve Story, written by a relatively unknown author named Chan Thomas. Please correct me if I'm mistaken. The book is similar to the works of Charles Hapgood and his theories on Earth crust displacement. However, the crucial difference is that the CIA classified the Adam and Eve story, and it was only recently declassified. Unfortunately, the book was heavily censored before its release, with over 70% of the original content omitted from the declassified version. Even entire pages are missing from earlier chapters without any explanation. After reading the declassified version, one might reasonably wonder, what the hell was in the book that the CIA felt the need to completely hide it from the public until now? And why are they still withholding the majority of its contents? Even though the sanitized version of the book still makes more sense than the works of Charles Hapgood, a lot of what is left in the book sounds far-fetched.